Okay, so this is part 2 of my 5-part series on Indigenising the Psychology curriculum in Australia. In this video, I'm going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to tell you about the Indigenising the Curriculum project. 2, I'm going to give you a brief history of Indigenous people in Australia and tell you what things are like for them today. And 3, I'm going to talk about the problems with the word Indigenous, because there's a big problem with the word Indigenous. Why I'm negative about positive
Back to the story, because I've got a story.
So I've got some top tips on
It
writing.
tells you to think critically. It helps people like me stop doing stupid things. Anyway,
So first, what is the Indigenising the Curriculum project in higher education? Well, it's a project that aims to do something about the fact that too few of our staff and students at university are Indigenous, and no one really teaches Indigenous knowledge in the university curriculum. It's also a project that's seeking to reconcile the damaging effects of colonisation and the harm Western knowledge has had on Indigenous people in Australia. Here is what happened. Knowledge was stripped out of the European colonies, out of places like Australia, loaded up with Western cultural assumptions designed to serve Western interests, and then returned to the colonies and used to exclude and marginalise the people who'd been colonised. In the early days, this process was blatant, fervent, and unapologetic, and was mainly done under the auspices of social Darwinism and through race science. You'll have seen a reference to that in the animated film in part 1. Now, race science became embedded in British psychology, particularly through the work of those working in the field of psychometrics, the area of psychology that focuses on testing people's psychological capacities. It is where this argument that black people are genetically inferior to white people came from, and that argument was mostly and infamously developed in the book called The Bell Curve, written by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. Why am I talking about British psychology? Well, because at that time, Australian psychology was a branch of the British Psychological Society, and it stayed that way until the mid-1960s. The Indigenising the Curriculum project, let's call it ITC, quicker to say. The ITC project, in some ways, aims to redress that horrid turn that Western science had taken in the past and the horrific treatment of Indigenous people under colonisation. And ITC is being undertaken most notably in Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, United States, and throughout the continents of Africa and South America, the former European colonies. The project's been going since the late 1990s and early noughties in universities as well as schools, and the project has progressed pretty slowly, particularly slow in Australia, only really starting to take hold since about 2008, but even then not having much of an impact really until quite recently. So now let's just remind ourselves of what happened when Australia was colonised by the British, and let's also have a think about that word Indigenous. So, on January the 26th, 1788, the first fleet moored at Sydney Cove, and that signalled the start of the British colonisation of Australia. At that time, there were more than 230 Indigenous nations, that's Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, who had held sovereignty over the land for more than 40,000 years. But the Brits decided the land did not belong to anyone and declared Australia was terra nullius, land of no one, which meant that Brits could legally claim it as their own. Now, the Indigenous nations disagreed, which resulted in them getting slaughtered by the British military force. So it's estimated that the Indigenous population of Australia was between 300,000 to 1 million prior to colonisation, and that was reduced to around 60,000 in the years following colonisation. It was a genocide. Those who survived largely still refuse to cede sovereignty of their land to this day. Following the genocide, social policies were enacted that enforced strict control over those Indigenous people who had survived. This included ghettoisation, where Indigenous people were moved into missions and reserves, assimilation, where Indigenous children were removed from their parents, known as the stolen generation, and welfarism, which was the strict monitoring of social behaviours to ensure compliance with authorities, and that still goes on today. These days, you can see that in more subtle areas of policy. These days, it sits under this guise of paternalism and protectionism. Now, if you think protectionism sounds a nice thing, to be protected. Ooh, sounds nice, doesn't it? All protected. Well, it doesn't necessarily feel like protection. I'll give you an example. The Northern Intervention National Emergency Response Act of 2007. It's known as the Intervention.
The federal government is about to intervene in Aboriginal communities in a way thought unimaginable just a few years ago.
We have decided to act. The decisions we have taken are non-negotiable.
The government's actions came in response to yet another report on the underlying conditions in Aboriginal communities.
In an unprecedented crackdown, the Prime Minister moved to take control. The government will seize control of Aboriginal townships and access to lands will be opened up.
We need to have control over the homes, the conditions that they are in, who is in them and what is occurring in those homes.
I don't think you can respect power structures in these communities when clearly those structures have failed to deliver.
Among his sweeping changes, dozens of extra interstate police will be sent in and 50% of welfare will be quarantined.
It is interventionist, I accept that, but what matters more? The constitutional niceties or the care and protection of young children?
That act imposed upon Indigenous communities in Australia's Northern Territory, alcohol bans and increased police surveillance. Things white Australians would never stand for, as they would rightly see such an act as infringing on their rights. That act was actually repealed in 2012, but it still largely continues today through the Stronger Futures in the Northern Territory Act of 2012. Now, these acts have had very little positive impact on the lives of Indigenous people, and they're little more than the public displays of how the government believes it's okay to infringe on the basic human rights of Indigenous people, as long as we're saying we're doing it to protect them. We say we're protecting them from themselves, and society has to take a paternal responsibility for them. The problem with paternalism and protectionism is that they're new manifestations of the earlier forms of colonial violence. So to be protected requires the protective intervention of the self-same forces that Indigenous people need protection from. European settler society. It's like the school bully beating you up and then saying to you that they'll protect you from further beatings by promising not to beat you up in the future as long as you do what they say. That's kind of what's going on. Protectionism also maintains the identity of the protected as subjugated. You're the one who needs to be protected by others who are more powerful than you. And what are the signs that Indigenous people are still victim to colonial violence? Well, that evidence can be found in the social and health statistics on Indigenous peoples that are now regularly reported under a federally funded and administered Close the Gap strategy. Close the Gap started in 2008 and was meant to improve the social and health outcomes of Indigenous people who, at that time, had a life expectancy on average of about 10 years less than non-Indigenous Australians, and where almost half of Indigenous men and over a third of Indigenous women died before they turned 45. The project set up various government-funded and coordinated programs that were focused on improving Aboriginal health and social opportunity. In 2020, the 12th annual report of the Close the Gap strategy reported that there had been no improvements in life expectancy for Indigenous people.
Mr. Speaker, for 12 years, I have sat in this chamber and listened to Closing the Gap speeches. It's a tale of hope, frustration and disappointment.
And successive governments on both sides of the aisle haven't been able to change that.
Yes, very, very sad indeed. Quite frankly, it's a disgrace.
Now, the thing to note here is how the ineffectiveness of the Close the Gap strategy is serving the interests of those who wish to promote the idea that Indigenous people's problems can't be fixed by social interventions because there's something genetically wrong with Indigenous people. The true story is that failures of the Close the Gap strategy are due to the paternalism of the approach. The programmes linked to the strategy are mostly led by non-Indigenous agencies who think they know better than Indigenous people as to how to help Indigenous communities. Also, the programmes are inadequately funded, poorly planned and poorly coordinated. Basically, they're set up to fail. Now, in part 3, I'll tell you about the history of psychology's involvement in the lives of Indigenous people and how they started off badly and continues badly to this day. But just before we end this video, I just want to say something about the term Indigenous. There's a problem with it. Now, there are lots of heated debates as to what Indigenous means and who can claim indigeneity, and it's actually a label that has become prized because in some countries it can afford a group specific rights over land and harvesting. Also, groups that engage in political activism are more likely to attract international public sympathy on the grounds of being seen as Indigenous rather than, say, as an ethnic group, for example. So this is why the definition is fought over.
The Indigenous opponents of the pipeline say it would threaten their land and way of life.
I don't need to listen to your options. This is our land.
Protesters across the country are standing in solidarity with the pipeline opponents. Concern for Indigenous people is fueling the protests.
Groups that are successful in claiming indigeneity are those that are the original inhabitants of their country and do not have sovereign power in their country because they were colonised in the past by another country. They were defeated by a colonising power. So a colonised group primarily has a legitimised claim for indigeneity if that group is happy to remind the world that they were defeated by a colonising power. Now that's hardly an empowering identity. You know, it's an identity that's defined as being a loser. You know, you're a loser. If you accept the identity of being Indigenous, you're saying to the world, I accept that I'm a loser. Now, we do have an alternative term, the term First People and First Nations, and these terms are taken up by many groups as a preferred label because they're not subjugating labels. They're not identities that have loser attached to their core. In fact, referring to First Nations in an Australian context has the effect of creating an identity that focuses on over 40,000 years of lived culture rather than just on the 200 years of colonial occupation. And it focuses on a remarkable story of survival. But the Indigenising the Curriculum project, ITC, cements the identity Indigenous into the debate, as does psychology. So that's what I will use in these videos. But do please hear the word Indigenous as a barbed one. It's a problematic one. So see it as a problematic term every time I say it. Okay, so that's all for this episode. I'll see you in part 3, where I'm going to take a look at the Australian Psychological Society and tell you how they're trying to make amends for their past mistreatment of Indigenous people and how they are getting it all wrong. Okay, till then, ta-da.